What if I told you that one of America's biggest car companies once did the math and decided your life had a price tag, and it wasn't worth the cost of a simple fix? Stick around, because what you're about to hear will change the way you think about the vehicles you drive forever. And if you want more shocking automotive truths like this, smash that like button and subscribe, because we're just getting started. Hey, this is Mark, and you're welcome to AUTOSAYS. So picture this. It's the early 1970s. America is cruising through an era of muscle cars and freedom on the open road. But behind the scenes, something dark is brewing at Ford Motor Company, something that would eventually lead to one of the most infamous corporate scandals in American history. Now, I know what you're thinking. How bad could it really be, right? Well, imagine driving down the highway with your family, music playing, everyone laughing, and then suddenly you're rear-ended at moderate speed. Nothing catastrophic, just a regular fender bender that happens thousands of times every day across America. But here's where it gets terrifying. Instead of walking away with whiplash and a damaged bumper, your car explodes into flames. I'm not exaggerating. Actual flames engulfing the vehicle within seconds, trapping you and everyone you love inside a metal coffin that's quickly becoming an incinerator. This wasn't some freak accident. This was the Ford Pinto. And this happened over and over again. And the worst part? Ford knew about it before the first Pinto ever rolled off the production line. But hold on, before we get into the nightmare details, let me give you some context about why this even happened. See, in the late 1960s, Ford was facing serious pressure from foreign competitors, particularly Volkswagen and Japanese manufacturers, who were flooding the American market with small, fuel-efficient cars that were dirt cheap. Lee Iacocca, Ford's president at the time, and honestly one of the most legendary figures in automotive history, decided Ford needed to fight back, hard and fast. His vision was simple yet ambitious. Create a car that weighed less than 2,000 pounds, cost less than $2,000, and get it from design to production in record time. We're talking about just 25 months instead of the usual 43. Now, that kind of accelerated timeline meant corners had to be cut. And boy, were they ever cut. Engineers were under insane pressure to meet deadlines and budget constraints. And somewhere in that chaos, a critical design flaw was overlooked, or more accurately, it was identified but deliberately ignored. The fuel tank in the Pinto was positioned behind the rear axle, and during testing, Ford discovered that in rear-end collisions, even at speeds as low as 21 miles per hour, the tank would rupture, spilling gasoline everywhere, and the impact would often cause sparks or puncture the tank with bolts from the differential, igniting the fuel and turning the car into a death trap. Now, here's where it gets absolutely chilling, and I want you to really absorb this because it shows how corporate thinking can go terribly, horrifically wrong. Ford's engineers actually came up with a solution, a simple fix that would have prevented these explosions. We're talking about adding a rubber bladder inside the fuel tank or installing a protective barrier between the tank and the rear bumper. The cost? About $11 per car. $11, less than the price of a decent pizza today, could have saved hundreds of lives. But Ford didn't do it, and you're probably wondering why. Well, this is where the finance part comes in, and trust me, it's going to make your blood boil. Ford's cost-benefit analysis team, led by some of the brightest minds in corporate America, sat down and did what they called a cost-benefit analysis, using something called the NHTSA, that's the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, guidelines. They calculated that fixing the Pinto would cost approximately $137 million across their entire production run. That's $11 per car times 12.5 million vehicles. Then they calculated the cost of not fixing it, and this is where it gets disturbing beyond belief. They estimated that the defect would lead to 180 deaths, 180 serious burn injuries, and 2,100 burned vehicles. Using federal government figures that assigned a value to human life at that time, about $200,000 per death, they calculated that lawsuits and settlements would cost them only $49.5 million. Do the math with me real quick. $137 million to fix the problem versus $49.5 million to just deal with the lawsuits and let people die. From a pure financial standpoint, letting people burn to death was the cheaper option, and that's exactly what Ford decided to do. Can you believe that? And before you think I'm exaggerating or that this is some conspiracy theory, these are actual documents that came out during court cases, real memos with real calculations, putting actual dollar amounts on human lives. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, this can't be real. Surely someone at Ford would have had a conscience, would have stood up and said this is wrong. But here's the thing about corporate culture and massive organizations. Decisions get diffused across so many people and departments that individual accountability disappears. Engineers report to managers, managers report to executives, executives report to shareholders, and everyone's just trying to hit their numbers, meet their deadlines, and keep their jobs. The human cost becomes abstract, just numbers on a spreadsheet, statistics in a risk assessment, not real people with families and dreams and futures. The Pinto launched in 1971, and by all accounts, it was initially a success, selling hundreds of thousands of units and helping Ford compete in the subcompact market. But then the reports started coming in. Accidents that should have been survivable, turning deadly. Families destroyed, lives ended in the most horrible way imaginable. One case that really brought this to public attention was the death of Lily Gray and 13-year-old Richard Grimshaw in 1972. Their Pinto was rear-ended, the fuel tank ruptured, the car burst into flames, Lily died, and Richard suffered catastrophic burns over 90% of his body, enduring years of painful surgeries and permanent disfigurement. The lawsuit that followed revealed Ford's internal documents, and when the public learned that Ford had essentially decided their loved ones weren't worth $11, the outrage was unprecedented. The jury awarded Grimshaw $2.8 million in compensatory damages and a staggering $125 million in punitive damages, later reduced to $3.5 million, but the message was clear. What Ford did was unconscionable. And here's a question I want you to think about. Where does corporate responsibility end and criminal negligence begin? Because Ford wasn't just making a business decision, they were actively choosing profit over human safety when they had full knowledge of the danger. This wasn't ignorance, it was a calculated gamble with other people's lives. And that raises some seriously uncomfortable questions about capitalism, corporate governance, and the value we place on human life in our society. But wait, it gets even more complicated because you have to understand the pressure these companies were under. The 1970s brought new federal safety regulations, emission standards, and increasing competition from abroad. American automakers were genuinely struggling to adapt, and the financial stakes were enormous. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of jobs, entire communities dependent on these factories, and shareholders expecting returns on their investments. Does that excuse what Ford did? Absolutely not. But it helps explain the mindset, the tunnel vision that develops when you're so focused on survival and competition that ethical considerations get pushed aside. The Pinto scandal led to criminal prosecution, something incredibly rare for a corporation at that time. In 1978, after 3 teenage girls died in a Pinto fire in Indiana, Ford was indicted on 3 counts of reckless homicide, the first time a corporation faced criminal charges for a defective product. Though Ford was ultimately acquitted, the trial itself was a watershed moment, forcing America to confront the question of corporate accountability in a whole new way. The financial fallout for Ford was massive, not just from lawsuits, but from the destruction of their reputation. The Pinto became synonymous with corporate greed and callous disregard for human life, and even today, over 42 years later, it's still the go-to example in business ethics classes worldwide. Ford eventually recalled 1.5 million Pintos in 1978, finally implementing the fixes their engineers had proposed years earlier. But by then it was too late for the estimated 500 to 900 people who died in Pinto fires. Now, here's what's really crucial for you to understand about this story and why it matters today. The fundamental tension between profit and safety didn't disappear with the Pinto. It's still with us in every industry, and the automotive world continues to grapple with these same issues. Think about the recent scandals: Volkswagen's emissions cheating, Takata's exploding airbags, GM's ignition switch defects. The pattern repeats because the same financial pressures and corporate structures that led to the Pinto disaster are still in place. Companies still do cost-benefit analyses, still weigh the expense of recalls against potential lawsuit cost, still push engineers to meet impossible deadlines with limited budgets. The difference now is increased regulation, more aggressive media coverage, and social media's ability to amplify consumer voices. But make no mistake, the temptation to cut corners when billions of dollars are at stake hasn't gone anywhere. So what can we learn from Ford's deadly mistake? First, that transparency and accountability in corporate decision-making aren't just nice ideas, they're essential safeguards against tragedy. Second,
that government regulation, while sometimes frustrating and expensive for companies, exists precisely because we can't always trust corporations to prioritize safety over profit. And third, that as consumers, we have power through our purchasing decisions, our voices, and our willingness to hold companies accountable when they put profits before people. The Pinto story is ultimately about the cost of doing business versus the cost of doing the right thing. And it forces us to ask ourselves what kind of society we want to live in. Do we want a world where everything, including human life, has a price tag that can be calculated on a balance sheet? Or do we want a world where some things are considered priceless and worth protecting regardless of cost? If this story shocked you, disturbed you, or made you think differently about the companies you trust with your safety, then do me a favor, hit that subscribe button because we've got plenty more untold automotive stories that will blow your mind. And drop a comment telling me what you think. Should corporate executives face jail time when
And drop a comment telling me what you think. Should corporate executives face jail time when their decisions lead to deaths? I really want to know what you think. This is Mark from AUTOSAYS, reminding you that every car has a story, and some of those stories need to be told no matter how uncomfortable they make us. Stay curious, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.